Let's jump right into this. Today we've got an incredibly dense and honestly fascinating explainer lined up for you. We are going to unpack a massive dossier of recent analytical reports, legal documents, and media critiques, all surrounding the 2026 NEET UG student protests in India. What these sources present is a highly charged, incredibly complex situation. We're talking about a student movement over exam leaks that essentially collided head-on with advanced state surveillance, aggressive media narratives, and some really intense political rhetoric. Now, to be clear, my goal here isn't to take a side. I'm just here to act as your guide. We're going to look really closely at what these specific reports are arguing and break down their claims so we can truly understand the anatomy of this entire event. So, here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the NEET UG protest crisis itself. Second, we'll dive into AI surveillance and state suppression. Third, we'll unpack the political threats and media propaganda. Fourth, we'll look at UN concerns and the global reaction. And finally, we'll explore the historical echoes of Azadi. All right, part one, the NEET UG protest crisis.
Okay, let's walk through exactly how this escalated, according to the sources. What started as a protest demanding an investigation into medical entrance exam leaks flared up super fast. By July 20th, during the Chalo Parliament March, reports indicate that police deployed tear gas and pellet guns against the students. Then, cut to July 23rd at Jantar Mantar. The reports show that specific students, like Ruchika Singh, were hit with targeted zero FIRs. If you don't know, a zero FIR is basically an immediate criminal complaint that can be filed anywhere, regardless of jurisdiction. In this case, it was for allegedly using objectionable language against the Prime Minister. Finally, by July 29th, after the Supreme Court intervened, the Delhi government actually paused action on these protest-related FIRs, assuming the individual didn't already have a criminal record.
Now, the physical crackdown described in these documents was allegedly extreme. The sources really highlight the use of pellet guns, and they point to a specific incident flagged by the Indian Medical Association, where a 19-year-old protester was left at serious risk of losing their eyesight. The IMA actually went as far as formally protesting the manhandling of female students during these clashes. And it wasn't just physical force like water cannons and CRPF barricades. The reports describe highly strategic blockades. We're talking about deliberate internet shutdowns around the Central Secretariat and closing down metro stations entirely just to stifle assembly. Moving on to part two, AI surveillance and state suppression. This is where things get almost sci-fi, but in a very real, very sobering way. Legal and human rights reports in our dossier claim that military-grade surveillance tech was unleashed on the crowds. They talk about Ikshana vans. These are vehicles rigged with 360-degree high-definition cameras doing instant, real-time facial scanning. But it goes further. Field police were reportedly wearing AI-powered smart glasses that could instantly pull up a protester's biometric data and even their academic history just by looking at them. At night, they allegedly used thermal drones to track students' heat signatures. And the biggest red flag raised by analysts here is the issue of false positives. Basically, flawed AI algorithms permanently blacklisting completely innocent students, which obviously threatens their future careers and things like passport verifications. The legal reports make a really stark comparison that you need to hear. They argue that this deployment directly mirrors the Israeli model. They specifically point to surveillance systems like Blue Wolf and Red Wolf, which are used to digitally cage, track, and profile civilian populations in occupied territories. By using these same Israeli-style tactics domestically, the sources claim the state is blatantly violating Article 21 of the Indian Constitution, which guarantees the right to privacy, as well as Section 66E of the IT Act, which covers the unauthorized capture of personal images. Because of these alleged violations, the legal sources lay out a very strict accountability matrix. Let's break down the stakes here. Field police could theoretically face up to 3 years in prison and dismissal for privacy violations. High-ranking bureaucrats, they could be looking at 1 to 5 years for abuse of power. And those private tech vendors supplying the AI software, they face massive civil penalties and government blacklisting for illegal biometric processing. So the analysts are making a really strong case here that this digital suppression isn't just unethical, it carries severe, undeniable legal liabilities. Let's look at part 3, political threats and media propaganda. To really grasp the kind of rhetoric being thrown around, a criminological report in our file introduces a crucial sociological concept, the dehumanization strategy. It's a psychological tactic, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's used to justify violence by comparing a target group to animals or insects. The reports explicitly note that some political figures and commentators were literally calling the students cockroaches, or arshula in Bengali, and labeling them anti-nationals. The sources argued this is a highly calculated profiling tactic. The goal? To completely strip away public sympathy, so that when violence does happen on the streets, the general public just kind of shrugs and accepts it. And listen, this rhetoric wasn't just name-calling. It escalated into direct, literal threats of physical violence. One report highlighted a genuinely shocking quote that was broadcast on national television by a political lawyer. The quote was, "Soyata hadi bengindebo," which translates to, "I will break your spine." The analysts make a vital point here. When legal professionals use the language of a lynch mob on primetime TV, it basically acts as an indirect green light for street-level cadres to go out and inflict real, grievous harm on everyday citizens. As you might imagine, the sources are highly, highly critical of mainstream television media's role in all this. They present a really sharp contrast for us. On one side, you have the media narrative, which allegedly framed the students as vulgar, anti-national, and part of some elaborate foreign toolkit conspiracy to destabilize the whole nation. But on the flip side, the reports argue the actual factual reality on the ground was just students holding the national flag and the Constitution, simply demanding justice for exam leaks, institutional corruption, and skyrocketing unemployment. Ultimately, the media critique documents come to a pretty damning conclusion. They argue that this segment of the press has completely abandoned its democratic watchdog role. Instead of questioning power, the sources argue they act as the azadir dushman, the enemy of freedom. By manufacturing these artificial debates and prioritizing fear-mongering over actual national crises, the reports claimed the media is deliberately distracting the public and actively running interference to shield institutional corruption. So we've seen the domestic perspective from these reports, but obviously a crisis of this scale doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? Which begs the question, how did the international community view this escalating domestic crackdown? That brings us to part 4, UN concerns and global reaction. The international reaction was actually quite swift. The reports highlight a very clear, very direct statement made during a press briefing in New York by Stefan Dujarric, the spokesperson for the UN Secretary General. He said, and I quote, "In any democratic system, citizens must have the right to protest peacefully without fear, arrest, or risk of physical injury. Protecting them is the primary responsibility of law enforcement." The reports emphasize this to show that the UN firmly views the excessive use of force against unarmed students as a direct violation of fundamental international human rights. Because of this massive gap between international standards and local actions, human rights desks cited in the reports are actually calling for international sanctions against commanding police officers. Their logic is built on 3 main pillars. First, ensuring systemic accountability. If domestic courts are too slow, things like travel bans or asset freezes step in. Second, creating a deterrence effect. The idea is to make officers think twice and realize there are personal consequences before obeying an illegal order. And finally, it's about showing global solidarity with victims who suffered life-altering injuries from state-inflicted violence. And finally, part 5, historical echoes of Azadi. Political analysts in our sources do something really interesting here. They trace a direct ideological lineage back through history. They look back to 1942, contrasting the revolutionary Subhash Chandra Bose, who was actively fighting the British, with groups like the Hindu Mahasabha, who the sources claim were actually collaborating with the colonial rulers. Then they moved to 1948. Noting the Communist Party's famous slogan, "Ye Azadi Juta Hai," basically arguing that political independence without economic justice was fake freedom. The analysts argue that today's 2026 student protests are just a direct modern continuation of this exact same historical debate over what true freedom actually means. The reports highlight a really deep, fundamental, ideological conflict. On one hand, you have Subhash Chandra Bose's vision of Azadi, which was this inclusive, unapologetic demand for total liberation. On the other hand, the sources point to the collaborationist roots of the ruling party's ideological predecessors. They explicitly name historical figures like Savarkar and Syama Prasad Mukherjee, who allegedly aligned with the British. And the reports do not hold back. They boldly claim that the current regime carries this Mihir Jafari DNA, essentially a legacy of betrayal. They frame them as the persistent enemies of freedom, who historically always try to crush revolutionary student movements. Bringing it all back to the present day, the political analysis wraps up with a pretty stark warning. The sources argue that the current political culture has morphed into what they call a new extremist religion. They say it relies heavily on a massive cult of personality, which effectively erases any sort of administrative accountability. In this kind of environment, the reports state that simply demanding basic constitutional rights, like, a fair exam or a decent job, is instantly branded as an act of treason by the state and its allies in the media. To counter this overwhelming state power, the reports invoke the spirit of the past. They quote Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose's immortal, legendary words, "Give me blood, and I shall give you freedom." For the analyst writing these reports, this isn't just some dusty history lesson. It's a call to action. They say it represents the exact kind of unwavering courage required to stand up to systemic oppression and fight for a pluralistic, just society, especially when the state is using literally every technological and rhetorical tool at its disposal to silence you. Which brings us to our final overarching question. We've seen these reports detail absolutely everything, right? From AI facial scanning and thermal drones, to media dehumanization, calling students cockroaches, to intense police crackdowns. So if modern technology and mass media are being leveraged to suppress the very citizens demanding basic constitutional justice, what does true democratic azadi even look like in the 21st century? It's something we all need to think about. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.